Hi, I'm Phailan, and we're here today to talk about diversity. Diversity is not a buzzword. Um, it's about innovation. It's about creating impact through multi-generational teams and different individuals. We have two fantastic experts on the panel today, one coming from the hard side of it and one coming from the soft side of it. So we're also going to look at some of their personal stories, the transformational outcomes that we've seen in managing innovation and friction. So welcome Gavin and welcome Rojane.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with asking you to introduce yourself, and then we can carry on with today's episode. Yeah.
I'm Rojane Gamsari. I'm a subject matter expert and consultant for the CIPD. I like to introduce myself sometimes as a HR geek. I absolutely love working with different organizations to help them see how they can deliver their objectives to their people. I think I've lost count of how many years I've worked in HR, but prior to moving to the region, I was a HR director of HR and OD for the National Health Service, responsible for developing HR as a profession across the country, which I absolutely love doing. So thank you for having me.
Welcome.
Cool. And I'm Gavin Aspen. I'm a partner in PwC Academy. I run a team of about 170 people from very wide diversity angles, both geography, gender, and ages.
Right. Welcome, Gav. So, that's one of the reasons I did not want to introduce the two of them, because they come from a mosaic of backgrounds. And I think the important thing here is not just about what is best practice, but also walking the talk. Research shows that there's a 19% impact of working with diverse teams and individuals on innovation. And my first question is to you, Rojane. Can you share a moment where you feel that diversity or a generational balance change the outcome of a project or a decision in your working life?
Thank you. Of course. So if we think about the link between diversity and innovation, right? A line that I always like to repeat and I truly believe in is diversity isn't a nice thing to do, right? It's business imperative. And I've said this in lots of different papers, articles, any stage that I can kind of stand on. And I think what I really mean by that is diversity is really about serving for being representative of the communities that you serve. Right. So if you are creating a service or a product as a business that's focusing on a certain community, you need to represent that in your workforce also. So you use the example of genders, right? So if you want to create an innovative approach or product for a female versus male, and if your team is majority or mainly male, you're not going to be able to create something that meets the needs of the community that you're serving. Rather than perhaps a personal example, I'll use an example I used recently, and it was from a TED Talk actually, and I found it really fascinating. Why is there always a longer queue in female bathrooms versus male bathrooms? Any thoughts?
Assume it's to do with cubicles and urines.
It was designed by a man.
Okay.
Obviously, putting all jokes aside, is because if we look at the stats of architects, it is a profession that's mainly male, right? So architects designing bathrooms, if they're kind of considering the needs of both genders equally, but because of our needs, be it physical, biological nature, social preferences, we spend more time in the bathroom. It's a fact. But so the way the bathroom should be designed, it should be designed with the needs of the customer, the needs of kind of ladies versus females, right? So females should have a bigger space. If we had more space in bathrooms versus male bathrooms rather than 50-50, that queue may be a little bit shorter.
Perfect. So I think you made a valid point around that diversity and inclusion is a must-have as opposed to a nice-to-have. And before I come to you, Gab, around this particular area, I remember this example about Airbnb and how they use diverse teams globally, and that created, the type of inclusion that they had in their innovation practice, helped them to design their product and service to go to market. So you're seeing very clearly that it's all about getting different mindsets, challenging the status quo, taking out the fatigue. Gav, I'm sure you have a multitude of examples you'd like to share, but give us your take on this.
Yeah, I think you hit on the sweet spot, the perfect quote, that you should always think about who the user is or the customer or what have you. It makes logical sense to say a woman should help in the design or be the whole process of designing a women's bathroom. And in the same way, I mean, a classic example for me, I remember in my previous job, we were talking about our digital marketing strategy and our online presence, mainly through social media. And we are talking the days of everything was Facebook. And before I went into a meeting to discuss that, I was interviewing someone for a potential role in our marketing team. And they were mid-20s, straight out of university maybe. They'd done a marketing degree. And we were talking to them and I was just like, it's not quite right here. I'm not gelling with them. The communication's not quite working. And I walked out of that interview straight into a meeting to discuss the social media presence of the organization. And the average age of the people around the table was my age. And I sat there for 5 minutes and I thought, we've made a mistake here. So I dashed out, and this person was doing some psychometric tests. I went and got them from the psychometric test, brought them into the meeting, and we basically did the interview as that meeting. Because at the end of the day, if we're trying to appeal to that age demographic, why wouldn't you use someone from that demographic? Because I'm out of touch with it. So logic says if you're trying to appeal to customers that are geographically diverse or gender diverse or whatever diverse, you need to use people in that process who understand that market, to put a cynical point on it. And there is a cynical point here with diversity. If you want to market to women, help use women to get your marketing campaign because they know the language to use, the imagery to use. If you have a man doing it, you're going to end up with some stereotypical nonsense, which is not going to appeal to anybody.
Yeah. Fantastic. And I go back to the CIPD purpose of great work and great working lives. And interesting that you talked about Microsoft actually uses inclusion matrix in their performance review so that, they drive out what we call a diversity fatigue. It's a tick in the box exercise. You just want representation from a very optical point of view. So that's a fantastic area. So we looked at the why of diversity. I think that's now been established. We're going into looking at the what of diversity. So take us through, Rajane, how would a diversity and inclusion strategy look like in an organization?
Okay. I think I'll take it back a step, right? If you're thinking about your business strategy, you're thinking about how can I have a plan, goals, objectives in place that helps us achieve our business numbers or kind of our business performance, basically. How can we increase our business performance? Then I think your diversity strategy should mirror that. How can we put a plan in place that enables our people to be the best versions of themselves? So when you put that lens on, it becomes less about a diversity strategy than more about business and people strategy. How can we enable our people to be the best versions of themselves so we can deliver our business objectives? For me, it's that simple. So you need to be able to link different practices to your business performance. And that's the lens I would put out in any strategy, but particularly when you're looking at diversity. And then that would get rid of some of the diversity fatigue that you were talking about. Because if you don't take that lens, then you are at risk of actually just tick box exercise, just so we can say we've got a diversity strategy in place. I'll give you an example. If you don't take this approach where you're thinking about your business objectives versus kind of how do we enable our people to do that, this may be slightly controversial, but unconscious bias. I absolutely hate unconscious bias training, right? Of course, it serves a purpose. Of course, it's great that, we bring in kind of awareness of what unconscious bias is. But I'd like to go a little bit deeper than unconscious bias training. Like, what led to that unconscious bias being there in the first place? Because often it's repeated behaviors, thoughts that leads to something being in your unconscious bias. So you need to try to tackle those and try to kind of, I guess, have more leadership, awareness of strategies that helps people be the best version of themselves, rather than we've done an unconscious bias training, tick.
Perfect. So, we're looking at the logic side of it, which you clearly mentioned, getting the best people out there, at the best situation, in their best level of competency to contribute at its best to all stakeholders. Gav, I'm going to switch this for you because I know you manage multiple teams. You've been, I've worked with you. I understand how you work. Your DNA. I want to take it away from anybody's looking at one of those startups or looking at setting up a team of people who can build innovation, have a team fluency, to be able to perform in a competitive marketplace. And I go to your other side of your official badge that you wear, and the training that you do outside your work with the women's rugby team in Dubai. And you've been open about it with me, and I'm glad that you're contributing to to uplifting the game, as Rajan said, not to put anybody in it. How would you relate that to what we're talking about now?
So rugby is a very interesting game, and I'm biased. I completely admit there's no sort of no doubt about it. Bias towards rugby because I love the game. I've played it, I've coached it, etc. Rugby is a great equalizer because there is a role for everybody, no matter what your body shape is, what your athleticism is, whether you're fast, whether you're slow, whether you're tall, whether you're short. There's a role for everybody. And that's one of the things I love about rugby as a sport. Training with women, I love training the women's rugby more so than men's, because the women's rugby game is actually a more technical game. Actually, because of the physiological differences in some cases between men and women. Women still tackle just as hard as men do, but what they often struggle with is a kicking game, especially at the grassroots level. So in a men's game, you'll kick the ball from one end of the pitch to the other, backwards and forwards, and it can get a little bit tedious, if I'm honest. In the women's game, it's much more technical because the kicking game isn't as strong, so therefore they actually have to play rugby. So the ball in play time in a women's rugby match is generally a lot longer than the ball in play time in men's rugby. So you can really develop people's skills at how to play themselves out of trouble rather than just kick the ball as hard as you can and see what happens. And I have to again explain my bias. Rugby is where I met my wife. She's played rugby for as long as I've known her, from her university days all the way through to the present day. And rugby has a great community spirit. No one cares what you look like. No one cares where you're from. No one cares even how old you are. Everyone just gets on with the game. And I think that brings us into the most important thing about diversity, if we want to call it diversity. At the end of the day, you bring the best you have to a situation. It shouldn't matter whether that is a man or a woman, whether it is someone in their 20s or someone in their 50s. You bring the best that is there. However, because of historical processes, people make assumptions. As we said earlier, my background as a partner, my background as more physical side of life. If I was sitting here wearing a t-shirt and you could see my tattoos and I talked about bodyguarding, you would form an opinion of me based literally on the way I look. That in itself is a function of diversity. People make assumptions, and until we can get to the point where people stop making assumptions,
absolutely,
we need unconscious bias training. Absolutely. We need diversity training. We need diversity strategies. I look forward to the day where we don't need a diversity strategy because it's just called a strategy.
That's right. Right. So I'm going to come to the matrix later on. So that's in the what. So when we talk about IQ and EQ, I think that diversity is about CQ. Cultural, the cultural quotient that you want. In that perspective, PwC's purpose is about building trust. So my question to you, Gav, is about how does a culturally diverse group of people who work at PwC, are in Dubai, build stronger team trust? You can reflect on the performance of the rugby teams you're coaching, the performance of the teams that you're influencing, or any type of example you would like to take from perspective.
there are so many different ways of looking at this. One way that I would look at it is, and it ties into bringing the best that you've got there. But imagine if you built a team of people around you that are exactly the same as you. If I take a rugby analogy, if I build a team of people that all look like me, you'd have a fantastic team as long as you kept the ball in your hand and pushed yourselves up this pitch. But no one's going to run rings around anybody. If I look at the team that I oversee and that I'm privileged to manage within PwC, if I employed people that thought the same way as me, we're going to have one idea because we all think the same way. So we're going to look at a situation, we're going to see the same solution. By surrounding myself with people that deliberately think differently to me, we end up with 100 ideas. And then part of my job is actually more difficult because I have to go through with the team to cut down to a workable number. Now, I don't mind where those ideas come from, but you do find the more diverse your team is, the more diverse the ideas tend to be. Whether it is gender, whether it is culture, whether it is background, whether it is economic circumstances.
Yeah.
You know, I tend to find that if you surround yourself by people that think differently to you, you get better innovation, better ideas, and better success.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's a matrix itself. I'm going to put you into a context which you worked in the UK, Rajin, with your permission, right? With the NHS, yeah. And I think when we look at the NHS, we look at the news and it's always out there. Of course, the postal department has now taken over, in terms of the newsworthiness of the content. But it's, I look at the NHS and I look at it like a chef. In a New York restaurant where you serve about 600 plates in a matter of 1:30 or 12:45 to 1:45, and there's no chance of getting things wrong because your customers walking in. I mean, from what we've been discussing about cultural fluency, about team dynamics, what's your take on it? What have you learned out of this that you brought into the CIPD? Professional map, what you share as the thought leader, and me knowing you personally, in terms of what you do in the classroom itself. Yeah,
I think your example of actually the rugby beautifully puts it all together, because I think if we even look at by definition of what we mean by inclusion, what we mean by belonging, is exactly what you described, Gavin. It's about creating an environment where we appreciate the differences, and that trust and that ability to speak is. I think in the NHS there are great programs like on speaking up and that creating that psychological safety, and that's really important in care. Right. For example, creating an environment where you feel safe to raise concerns, errors, that doesn't happen overnight. That happens very intentionally, to create an environment where people have that trust and that safety that if something goes wrong, I have the power to raise that concern. And that's really key in healthcare. So creating that psychological safety where people are not scared, like if a doctor, not to say it's of course it's perfect and errors don't happen and we didn't have any kind of situations, but to create that environment where a doctor or a nurse can feel safe to raise concerns, so then we can learn from those mistakes rather than kind of penalize for them. I think that's really key. But again, that sense of belonging, that everyone has a voice, everyone can contribute, these are all things that have to be done in an intentional way. So when you think about strategy, you need to put things in place that creates that environment. The rugby scenario, that doesn't happen overnight. That happened by creating a space where you understand the differences and you can use those differences to your advantage rather than try to copy and paste a scenario.
Absolutely. See, you're hitting on a very valid point in terms of multi-generational diversity, and you're talking about purpose-driven and job security. You started with employee voice, psychological safety. I can be in front of Gab and tell him this is what I think about what your strategy is, and he would argue back with me, but he wouldn't use it as a basis of judging how I look at things or how we look at things. So I think you have a valid point. We're moving towards the more leadership side of this. There are a lot of leaders at different levels who want to learn from your experiences, your collective experiences on what you have done. So how do leaders actually manage in the age of hyperdiversity? If you were going to look at three things that you would say to a leader, in terms of you have becoming, you have a Gen Z, you have a baby boomer. One of the questions that we are looking at is that they found out that older generation are better at problem solving than the younger generation. Yeah, this is coming from research, right? So what are like the three things, that you would want to, share with those leaders, future leaders, those on the, on the learning level or moving to the next level, maybe from a person of managing self, right, as well as managing others. Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
So it's an interesting question, and it's one that I've been asked a number of times. Not necessarily three things, but we'll
There'll be more.
One of the most important skills I feel for a leader, irrespective of whether we're talking about wellness, diversity, getting the job done, strategy, whatever, the first thing that I say every leader should have is an intellectual curiosity.
Okay.
You should need to understand things. I look at my mobile phone and I don't just accept what it does. I want to know why. If it's an AI engine, I want to know how it's thinking, how it's working. If I'm looking at a successful team, I want to deconstruct it to understand the dynamics of that team that made it work so well. Not necessarily to destroy it, but to deconstruct it to understand. So having an intellectual curiosity in the area of diversity is key. Why is it that you may think differently to me? Why is it that you may think different to me? Without judging, and that's the second thing, a lack of judgment, is I don't have all the best ideas. By a very long shot, I don't have the best ideas. What I have is a skill set for sorting ideas and for discussing it. And I tell all of my team, you have the obligation to dissent. Your job is to disagree with me. Yes, do it appropriately, professionally, in the right environment, etc. But your job is to disagree with me because I don't have the right. Don't just say yes, Gav, because I'm the boss. It's like anyone can have a good idea, and I might not be looking at the problem through the lens that you're looking at. Now, I remember one leader that I had, and apologies for going on this, but one leader that I had many years ago, and he described his leadership team as a wagon wheel, an old-fashioned wagon wheel with a big hub and then spokes that came out of it. And he said, he is the hub. Everyone on that leadership team is a spoke in that wheel. If all the spokes are on one side, the wheel will collapse as soon as it turns. But his job as the hub is to take the information from all of those different people and then make a decision. So therefore, his job was to listen first and speak later. And so those are the three things. So to me, it's intellectual curiosity about everything. It's about openness and lack of judgment. And then finally, it's about listening to understand. Not just listen to get to speak, but listen to understand.
Right. I'll try to bring this together. I'm trying to build type of a mosaic of stuff which comes out of your amazing thinking. Rojin, any diverse or any thoughts from you from your experience?
I think that's spot on. I think listening, but listening to understand, as you said, I think is really key to treat people as an individual. So if you're managing a team, if you're leading a team, understand your team, understand what makes them different, understand what they bring to the table, that diversity of thought, and of course what motivates them. So I think it is that listening with curiosity, that to understand what motivates people, I think would be key. Because then I think for me, it's about storytelling, right? Because how can you motivate your team? How can you motivate your team to understand this is their purpose, this is how they contribute to kind of vision of the organization. I think once you can build that story for them, then you can kind of match that. Okay, this is what you bring, this is your piece of the puzzle, and this is how we can help you get there and how we can help you grow at the same time can achieve the organizational objectives. So I think understanding your team will be key to help them see themselves as a piece of the puzzle. Then I would say as a leader, particularly when I think this becomes even more important if you have a diverse team, is that transparency and fairness. So I would say those two things. It doesn't matter how complex, it doesn't matter if everything's going pear-shaped, it doesn't matter if you're restructuring, even often, there's a difficult conversations you have to have as a leader. I think if you're transparent in your approach, you're very clear about kind of the story of the organization and next steps, but whatever the action is, to come treat it with fairness. So you're then combining your understanding of the team matched with the organizational objectives in a fair, consistent and transparent way. Then I think that would be good.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're trying to build a where are you now or where do you want to go type of or how do we get there type of simplistic worksheet, what the two of you are talking about, how I can bring it together is diversity is about a process in the organization, who you recruit, how you recruit, how you evaluate performance, how you reward. It's also about the people. You can have a great process, right? But in terms of setting up the team, but you also need the people, those mindsets, their DNA, their voice, how they feel in the company, their health and well-being. You have to have both working. Otherwise, you just not walking the talk, and you're not going to get the innovation and the profitability that your organization is looking for. Am I right to say that?
Definitely. I think the diversity is the golden thread. Diversity should be everything that we do, right? It's not just one or two things. It's not one process. It's not one business objective. It is how you link everything together. It's the glue. It's that if you have that, whatever your strategy is, whatever your business objectives are, if you're doing it with always a lens of, what's the diversity lens? How is diversity connecting everything? How is diversity a golden thread? Then we move away from diversity being a thing, diversity being a tick box, and being diversity being everything that we do. I think you can genuinely improve almost any situation or any kind of product or a service offering if you're doing it with how are we representing the communities that we serve, how representative are we doing this with the lens of this is what our customers need, this is how we represent our customers, therefore this is what we need to hear and we need to understand.
Perfect. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I completely agree with that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, to me, it's about losing the tags of diversity. And there is a process we have to go through as a civilization to be able to remove the tags of a diversity agenda. I think we've moved on massively towards that, but there's still a way to go. And I think the first thing you have to do is to admit there is an issue that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely.
If somebody is genuinely not seeing gender, not seeing color, not seeing religion, not seeing those kind of things, they don't need diversity training because it's not affecting them. But unfortunately, we live in a world where people do see color, they do see gender, they do see age, they do see those things. And until we get to that point where we can forget about it, we're going to need to push the diversity agenda quite rightly into recruitment, into performance. But as you said, at the end of the day, logic, common sense, everything says if you understand who your customers are and you represent your business in the way that your customers are represented, mathematically, you're going to make more profit. It's as simple as that, really.
Absolutely. And I think we go back to the first 10 minutes of this discussion when you talked about, you asked the question about the ladies' toilet, and you your metaphors on the rugby and how the game itself is different. And you're right. So I think diversity is not a bolt on. It has to be built in. So I'm coming in, it's all about your purpose, your leadership. It's about action signals and words. And I think this is what the emphasis. So we're on the last phase of the discussion. I think we can go on for long. I mean, you can reach out to these two wonderful people and me, or the CIPD if you want to have a meaningful discussion. You're talking about a multi-generational workforce, and I think I want to focus on Gen Z, people born after 1998, just to bring context, and the baby boomer. So what advice would you give to those senior leaders who find it very challenging to be reverse mentored by a 25-year-old, a 26-year-old, or a 21-year-old in their organization? How do you approach this? Any thoughts?
I get reverse mentored every day. I have 3 children.
Absolutely.
They're teenagers. I don't understand 90% of what they tell me.
Yes.
So I ask them what things mean.
Yeah.
And I think as a senior leader, don't be afraid to ask, because there's nothing wrong. We have, I think as a lot of senior leaders, sometimes there's a intellectual insecurity. You're afraid of saying, I don't understand, or I don't know. To me, that is part of leadership, is being comfortable in your own intellect so that you can say, sorry, I don't understand. An example that's not quite the way where you want to take this, but for various reasons, as I was growing up, my vocabulary did not develop as well as a lot of my peers. So my vocabulary is smaller than a lot of people. And sometimes I'll sit in meetings and people will use ridiculously long words because they're just using ridiculously long words. I have no problem with saying, sorry, what does that mean? And I don't feel that I lose anything as a leader for doing that. And so therefore, when I get a message on WhatsApp or whatever from my kids and they hate using WhatsApp, they only use it because I use it. And I get a message and they've got some sort of emojis or what have you on. And sometimes I go back and say, okay, what do you mean by this? Because I know what I think you mean, but that clearly is not what you actually mean.
Yeah.
So I think if you're a senior leader and you're dealing with Gen Zs, treat it like someone from a different culture. Ask them what they mean by a certain thing. Don't assume and don't Google it or don't chat GPT it. Just say to them, sorry, I don't quite understand, I don't quite follow you. But one thing I would say is don't always assume that it's the senior leader that has to change. There is an element here, and I do a lot of university talks talking to Gen Z who are coming through. And I say to them, bear in mind that the person interviewing you is probably not Gen Z. And so therefore you need to understand the way the older generation thinks as much as the older generation needs to understand and work hard to the way you work. Think of the way you explain things and clarifying and using perhaps
and patience. What do you think about that? I mean, in terms of emotional regulation, in terms of patience, in terms of problem solving compared to the Gen Z. What's your...
who did the research?
Yeah.
Was it Gen Xers?
Would I say better? I think is better the right term. I think different.
Different, yeah.
Different, right? And it's not one or the other. I think you need the different thought processes, different ideas, right? Everyone brings something different to the table, and it's what the Gen Z versus other generations bring to the table.
Have you heard of that song Anxiety?
Tell me.
Yeah. So do you feel that a Gen Z group, I have two daughters as well.
Yeah.
They tend to be a little bit anxious about things, the world. How can we harness that as leaders to build a purpose-driven organization?
So one thing I would say is anxiety is obviously medical conditions, etc. And let's talk a little bit more about that term. Somebody who gets anxious because of not getting enough likes on a post on Snapchat, whatever it is, at the end of the day, they are learning resilience in a way that we never had to learn. I was not judged by thousands of people in 15 seconds after I make a post. I would dread to think how I would cope with that if that was the case. Whereas my kid will come down and go, oh yeah, I only got 1,000 likes for that. So there's resilience in there, but it's not resilience in the way that I might recognize resilience. And that's where we need to understand this different skill set. But at the end of the day, it depends on who you're trying to appeal to. The Gen Z or whatever they get called at any time, they have their own skill set developed through their own development. And we need to nurture that and encourage it. And I'm sorry, people say, oh, Gen Z, they need praise for everything. Is that a bad thing that we say thank you a bit more and that we praise people when they do good work? As long as the flip side is they don't blame people all the time. Public praise, private blame, that's always the way it should be. So I think we're very quick to judge the next generation's skills as being worse than ours, but we're only judging their skills by the way that we would judge ours. So problem solving, you think, oh, they're not as good as problem solving because they don't look at problems the same way that I do. And in fact, if anything, we're the wrong people to ask because we are not Gen Z. So therefore, how a Gen Z faces a problem is a different way of thinking to me. But that's what I want, because if I've got a problem I can't solve, bring me a Gen Z, they may be able to solve it quicker.
True. I mean, in terms of getting a scorecard on diversity and inclusion, this is an area which it's a lot of debate. There are different schools of thought. My final question is on the business case. As people practitioners, we bring in a well-being program, we bring in a diversity and inclusion program, we bring in something else. And what the C-level board would ask us is, what's the impact? What's the ROI? What's the business case? How is it finally going to affect the business, our people, and the performance out there in the marketplace? So very quickly, what are your thoughts? I mean, if somebody is setting up a set of matrix, maybe 3 matrix, you already have provided that answer. I mean, what matrix should you be looking at if they want to, walk the talk with diversity or sustain or be consistent in and avoid the fatigue that we were talking about?
I think we should absolutely look at impact, and we should absolutely look at what's the evidence, right? And we need to do more of that, particularly as a kind of people profession. But we've been kind of guilty of not being evidence-based enough.
Absolutely.
Right. So I think it's very important. We absolutely should focus on how we're measuring a return on investment. It may not necessarily be investment. It may be more impact, how we're evaluating success, and so on. And I think there can be lots of different measures of success, right? So it's not just about kind of data on demographics, so, right? Diversity is more than that. And so when you're looking at evaluating any sort of kind of people strategy, I've changed my approach slightly, I'd say, in this region. Before, I used to love kind of your key people metrics. I used to love using it, kind of the retention stats for every single business case. How did it reduce retention? How did it impact turnover? And so on. But I think in this region, when you look at turnover, it is a little bit different, right? Particularly when a lot of people's kind of visa is attached to their roles here. So I don't think that retention, as an example, paints the right picture if you're looking at measure of success, because often people stay in jobs because it's linked to their livelihood here rather than their choice in staying in an organization. I'd say if we're looking at kind of scorecards and what's the right way to measure success when it comes to people strategies, one of my new favorites is ENPS. So lots of organizations have net promoter scores, right? How likelihood are your customers to recommend you, right? It should be the same for employees.
Absolutely.
How likely is that employee to recommend you as a place to work? I think that's a really key, and it's a new stat that I prefer using
In executive reviews.
instead of our
Oh, that's
turnover.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great insight.
And I think when you look at, we're talking about Gen Zs in particular, right? It is different. It's understanding that what they bring is different. So their measure of success might be different. How we develop. So if you're looking at kind of your development stats and your success stories, for Gen Zs, it is different. But I think it goes back to understanding different generations, what motivates them and what's important to them.
Great insight. Gav, any final thoughts on?
There are some metrics which are obvious. So, for example, I'm involved in a t-shirt business, and they sell them at various different events. I'm not going to plug you with the name. And we have people that go and sell these things for us. And if I go and try and sell it, we're trying to sell quite fashionable t-shirts to teenagers and 20-year-olds. If I go, they're not going to buy a thing, and I'm probably going to get arrested. If one of my sons goes, he cleans up, because he's that generous. So there's an immediate metric and saying, okay, well, I sold nothing, he sold 100 shirts. But the thing that I keep saying is, coming back to this idea of this concept of having no labels. So when you're trying to do an ROI on something which is about creating no labels, that's like turning around and saying, I'm trying to walk into a room. What's the ROI on opening the door? It's not an ROI, it's an essential for you to succeed. It's more a case of, take two companies, one that does push the diversity agenda and one that doesn't. You will see the difference soon enough, because as time passes, the one that is not demonstrating diversity will lose their customers, they will lose their products in that space. So I don't necessarily think everything has to have an ROI on it. Wellness, yes, you can measure things like sickness rates, retention rates, etc. Yes, and your point is absolutely right that people sometimes stay in jobs for maybe not the right reasons. But it's the same with diversity. To get into the room, you have to open the door. There's no ROI on opening the door. You just have to do it. And that's how I see diversity. This is not something that you spend $1 million, you're going to get X back. Yeah. It's you spend $1 million because if you don't, you won't be getting anything back over the next 5 years. You have to evolve. Yeah. And that's what I see. I see diversity and inclusion as an evolution. It's opening the door to get into the room. It's not measurable in the same way as employing a new salesperson.
Perfect. Yeah. So thank you so much for those great insights, great stories. Just to put it into perspective, we looked at the why of diversity, we looked at the what of diversity, we looked at the how of diversity, we looked at the hard side of diversity, we looked at the soft side of diversity. A big thank you to Gav and Rajane. Amazing insights. And if you are a collaborator, if you're looking for collaboration, if you're a startup, if you want to get your team going and innovating and performing at the next level, I'm sure you've seen some of the tools, the perspectives, and also some of those caveats that you should be looking at. On behalf of PwC and CIPD, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.